Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us each week to update us on all of the latest events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on the current situation in Israel for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. Lots going on, lots to get through. As this webinar is happening, Israel's War Cabinet is meeting to discuss what's been proposed from the Qatari and the Egyptian side regarding the hostages. The proposal appears to be, obviously the exact details haven't been released, but we understand that some of the ideas proposed, which are not necessarily new, are that Israel would allow Hamas leaders to go into exile from the Gaza Strip in exchange for the hostages, and there would be obviously a complete cessation of hostilities, and I believe also some Palestinian convicted prisoners would be released as well. According to Hamas official quotes, this is still a non-starter. They will not discuss anything until there's a ceasefire, and they will not agree to anything until that doesn't involve a complete ending of the hostilities. And obviously they would like to remain very much in power. But what seems to be happening is there does seem to be movement. There does seem to be some optimism from some of the sides. The fact is that there are people visiting, talking, negotiating, and the Israeli cabinet tonight is meeting to discuss this. So it's clear that there is something going on. Now, it could be that, which is quite likely, that Hamas have not acquiesced to the Qatari negotiation. So Israel wants to be seen not as the negative part, not as the party to the negotiations that says no, knowing full well that Hamas probably won't agree to it anyway. So it could be that this is part of a sort of game of bluff. It could be that if Israel won't necessarily agree, but will not necessarily disagree at this point, and will allow the talks to progress, to put pressure on Hamas. Perhaps, as many have stated over the last few months, the Qataris do have a lot of say, a lot of sway, a lot of pressure over Hamas, and perhaps now is the time for them to deliver. So Israel perhaps is playing this game where it wants to see how much the Qataris can deliver, and if they can put pressure, and if they themselves are exasperated by Hamas's rejectionism. So it seems at this point that Israel isn't rejecting these talks out of hand. Also, as one can imagine, there's also a lot of pressure from the hostage families in Israel. So it seems that we're quite far away from another hostage deal, but it does seem like things are moving. Many of the actors that are involved in the last hostage deal are getting together, trying to flesh out ideas, trying to get to some sort of resumption of negotiations, and trying to push forward plans of their own, as opposed to the last one that was sort of negotiated largely between the parties with the intermediaries. Now the intermediaries are trying themselves to promote their own plans. Obviously, the intermediaries themselves, whether it's Qatar, Egypt, obviously have their own interests. Whether it's Qatar's role, the longer they're seen as important intermediaries, the less pressure there is for them to lose their contacts and turn away from Hamas and other Islamist terrorist groups. Egypt obviously has a role here because they're very concerned about the situation. They want to insert themselves as much as possible. And Cairo seems to be the ground zero at the moment for all hostage negotiations, and even discussions on the day after. Israeli senior officials have been visiting Cairo to talk about what the day after would look like, where Israel would maintain control, whether it be on the so-called Philadelphia corridor, which separates the Gaza Strip from the Sinai, part of Egypt. So everyone has an interest in being involved in negotiations, but it's clear at this point negotiations haven't yet come to the point where they're going to bear fruit. But it's certainly one to keep an eye on. Furthermore, today we had Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, visit Israel. He's doing quite a jaunt in the region. He's been to a number of countries, and he's, I believe, at the moment in Bahrain. But he was in Israel, and he was also in Ramallah to meet with Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas. In Israel, it was certainly difficult conversations all around. There was quite a unique, event after his meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu, that neither side gave a readout of the event. Neither side put out a press release. That's pretty unusual. I'm pretty sure that every single time Blinken or any senior official has visited Israel and has met with Prime Minister Netanyahu, there has been a press release. At least Netanyahu puts out something about his side of the discussions and what he laid clear to his American counterpart. Nothing of the sort came out. Apparently, by all accounts, it was a difficult meeting. The Americans have certainly changing their tone towards Israel's operations. They still are very supportive of Israel's right to respond and to defeat Hamas, but there is growing concern about what Blinken reportedly said was to try and avoid civilian harm. Well, that's obviously very difficult when it's also well understood by the Americans that Hamas have an interest in causing civilian harm and use Gazan civilians as human shields. But a lot of this is to play for domestic public. We're now in an election year in the US, and obviously the Democratic Party's more progressive wing is coming under is putting more and more pressure on the administration to try and push for a ceasefire and to try and hold Israel culpable for the loss of life on the Palestinian side. So it's clear that a lot of patience is being run out, but the Israeli position has pretty much not moved since October the 7th, and there is still an understanding that Israel has to continue doing what it's doing. It is winding down operations in the north, and a certain amount of reserves have been sent home. It's not going to be the same level of operations, and there's increasing talk of moving to stage 3, something that Blinken did talk about in his prepared remarks. He gave prepared remarks. I can't remember if it was alongside the defense minister or the foreign minister on his own, because the other meetings, they did release readouts, and Blinken himself really liked to talk a lot about what the Israelis are doing as far as moving to a lower intensity stage. But it does seem at the moment that Gaza is split up into various areas. Obviously, they're ready for stage 3 in the north, where they pretty much conquered the area and broken up Hamas's power base there. But in the south, it's still very much on stage 2, where they really still have to flush out and are doing sometimes face-to-face combat in very many parts of the south. So it was quite a prickly arrival of the Secretary of State. Probably is just going to get worse and worse. From a very high after October 7th, where everyone was on the same page and there was a lot of sympathy. It's clear that sympathy is eroding, even amongst Israel's friends in the US. Tomorrow we're going to see something unprecedented. The International Court of Justice in The Hague will start preliminary hearings on a case that the Republic of South Africa has brought against the State of Israel on the charges of genocide, which is quite a remarkable thing. And anyone who follows the conflict knows that this is nothing approaching genocide, but in the realm of the international community, international justice, facts and reality do not matter as much as politics, as the ingratiation of certain regimes around the world. So it's clear that the the enemies of Israel chose very wisely in asking South Africa to launch this particular charges because of the whole history there of apartheid. There is a certain resonance around the world when South Africa, the victims of apartheid, bring such a case forward. And there's many elements to it. First of all, let's go into the details. There'll be a panel of 17 judges, 15 members of the ICJ, and then one country from the country that's charging and the country that's being charged. In other words, a representative from South Africa and a representative from Israel. There will be 3 hours of arguments from either side. And what the South Africans are asking for is a ruling on provisional measures, which is expected in the next few weeks. What that means is the case against Israel for genocide will go on for months, if not years. But what they are trying to do is they're trying to get a provisional ruling that could perhaps call Israel to stop its war, could perhaps call on Israel to allow more humanitarian aid, could call on all sorts of things. That's what the South Africans and the people behind, the enemies of Israel behind South Africa, are certainly trying to push. Now, we've got to understand the ICJ is a problematic court. We know from the 2004 ruling against Israel's security barrier in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank that it is highly politicized. Much of that ruling in 2004 basically went against the own regulations of the ICJ. But, when Israel's concerned, precedent, rulings, statutes really go out the window. So there is some concern in Israel that clearly this is not genocide. I mean, anyone who's even neutral understands that. But there is still the problem of politicization of this international body. And if there is a ruling against Israel, it could have major diplomatic repercussions. Obviously, the ICJ does not have the ability to do anything more than give a ruling. It's not the ICC. The ICC can put out warrants against individuals. The ICJ can give a ruling, and it can even advise the Security Council to pass resolutions that may place sanctions against the state. But with the US veto, that's highly unlikely. And obviously the US, as an ally of Israel and understanding the situation, has come out very much that this is a ridiculous charge against Israel, and it stands very much against it. But it is one that can, as I said, have major diplomatic repercussions. One can imagine if Israel is successfully charged with being a state that's engaged in genocide, one can only imagine what the repercussions for that will be in the public opinion, in diplomatic repercussions in relations between states. But Israel is pulling out all the stops. Whereas in 2004, it decided not to play any role in that decision. On this one, they have done, because it is such a serious case that it's not one that they can ignore. And also it's one that they feel that they can win here because the facts are very much on their side. Now, if we look at the makeup of the panel of judges, we see around 9 judges are from democracies, are from, quote unquote, Western countries, which usually that means that there'll be professional judges that will look at the case on their merits, which is obviously a good thing for Israel. But there are other countries which are, let's just put it mildly, less than democratic. 2 of those countries, China and Russia, may have their own interests in pushing down this charge, because both of those countries could then find themselves attacked, what China is doing with some of its minorities, what Russia is doing with in Ukraine. So there may be some political reasons why this will be quashed, as well as obviously the legal and real time ramifications. So we'll have to wait and see. Because it's taking it so seriously, something quite extraordinary took place. Israel, under Prime Minister Netanyahu, chose who has been, I should say, the real sort of devil of the Israeli right for the last year, Aon Barak, Israel's former Supreme Court justice, to be Israel's judge who sits on the panel of the ICJ. Now, that's quite, as I said, quite interesting, because he is the one who's been blamed for Israel's current judicial system, which the right wants to reform. But also he was quite a clever pick, because he is well respected around the world. And moreover, he is a Holocaust survivor. So this is someone who not just knows about genocide, experienced genocide. So that could also play very much into this. Just in the final couple of minutes before we go to questions, other issues, the relationship between the Security Cabinet and the Chief of Staff fell to a new nadir this week when Herzi Halevi, the Chief of Staff, was attacked in the Security Cabinet when he talked about the creation of a panel to look into errors that were made in the lead up to and during October 7th. He talked about bringing a panel together of former Chief of Staff, including Shaul Mofaz and others, and this was attacked by members of the Security Cabinet, first of all because they don't like people like Shaul Mofaz, who were seen as left-wing opposition figures, but also any sort of investigation panel perhaps could point fingers higher up at the political level. Herzi Halevi retorted, and the army is very keen on trying to learn lessons because as it goes forward in war, these are some of the lessons that may need to be learned, especially if Israel at one point needs to face the north and fight Hizballah. It needs to learn the lessons of its previous failures to hopefully achieve more in the future. And Herzi Halevi today in Gaza, when he was speaking to the troops, he did refer very much to Hizballah and says, just as you fought in Gaza and you know every single inch and you know exactly what you're able to do, so the same is true in Lebanon, sending a very strong hint towards Israel's capability should a war break out in the north. Finally, another unprecedented event started moving this week, where a member of the Israel Beitenu party basically tried to oust another member of Knesset, Ofer Kasif, a member of the Arab Party, a Jewish member of a sort of supposed to be not necessarily an Arab party, but he's the only Jewish member. He has signed on to the ICJ charges, the South Africa charges, that charges the country which he represents. He is a member of its parliament with genocide, and that outraged, as one can imagine, a lot of Israelis, and especially in the Knesset. To oust a sitting MK, you have to have 90 signatures, which is 3/4 of the total. At the moment, he has 85. There are still 5 holdouts that need to be signed on. Obviously, the Arab parties themselves will never sign on to this, but there's a few others that are still waiting to be brought over. So if Ofer Kasif is moved out, is struck out of the Knesset, then that certainly will be unprecedented. And happy to answer any questions on any of these issues or anything else.
All right, thank you so much. So the first question we have is from Carrie Hillebrand asking, does Israel have estimates as to how many combatants are combat-capable terrorists remain?
It's a very difficult question to know exactly how many there are. Israel has said that it has killed 8,500 Hamas terrorists, actual combatants, since it entered the Strip, and that's on top of the 1,000 that were killed on October 7th, or the days after, of those who came across the border. It is estimated there's around 30,000 Hamas fighters. So it's well over a quarter. A lot of them have regrouped and are now based in Rafah, amongst civilian populations, fighting from schools, fighting from hospitals, fighting from mosques. But Israel is making severe inroads. It's clear that the whole setup of Hamas has been severely disrupted. A lot of these fighters are just fighting individuals or in small groups. There's very little command structure left. So it has made significant inroads there, but the exact numbers are difficult to surmise at this moment in time.
Thank you. Len Levin asks, is there any more information on what plans Israel has regarding the status of the government for Gaza after the war is at its end?
Not yet. There are supposed to be discussions on this. They've been put off a couple of times. There have been certain proposals, exactly what could happen. The Americans and much of the international community are very keen on the PA, the Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas, to come in. For this Israeli government, and Prime Minister Netanyahu is pretty much said so on numerous occasions. That's a non-starter. They feel that the PA Fatah is pretty much just as bad as Hamas and certainly no better. They are paying, and it was released this week that the murderers of October 7th, those that survived will receive a stipend, those who are in prison, and those who died, their families will receive a stipend from the PA. So, that's basically financially supporting the death squads of Hamas. So the PA is certainly not seen as a solution by many in Israel, and I think it would even go beyond the government. I think you'd be hard pressed to find too many Israeli voices in the government or outside of it who are in favor of the PA. The other solution possibly might be to find some local leaders, but it's very difficult to find anyone of any leadership level in Gaza who is not some way affiliated with Hamas. So that is also an extremely difficult proposition, to find someone who could lead, who could have some sort of authority, who would be listened to, who has no connections with Hamas. So that's also going to be a very, very difficult thing. And at the moment, Israeli officials are basically saying they're concentrating on the war at this point, and there is certainly no unified approach. Even though another message that Secretary of State Blinken brought with him this week was that that there'll be no permanent reoccupation of Gaza by Israel. There'll be no settlements, and there'll be no removal of Gazans from the Gaza Strip. So the Americans are very keen to tell Israel what the parameters of what it can do, but the Israeli government itself hasn't really decided for itself yet.
Thank you. And on Blinken's comments, Merdad Kansari asks, what are the feelings in Israel about Blinken's comments about the need for creating an independent Palestinian state, albeit with reformed leadership, as he has underlined?
You'll find, as I said, you'll find very, very few Israelis who will support a Palestinian state. I mean, what happened on October 7th, one can imagine what would happen if this was done by a state. The ferocity of it and the difficulty that Israel would have afterwards in response. And just as I said, while much of, I've said this a few times in the last few weeks or even few months, that while much of the world has moved on and is focused on other things or focused on the Israeli response and the suffering of ordinary Gazans, for Israel, we're still stuck in October 7th. Every news channel, every news program still leads with new evidence of, the torture, the rape, the burning, the mass execution that took place on October 7th, the stories of the hostages. I mean, there was pictures released this week of some of the young girls who were kidnapped, and it's really unfathomable what they're going through. So Israelis are certainly in no mood to talk about a Palestinian state. It's the furthest thing from anyone's mind. Even those on the far left who previously, were extreme adherents of a two-state solution are really not talking that language at the moment, because they how can you reward these people? How can you give these people a state on the doorstep of our communities after we believe that they wanted peace? We believe that they wanted a better life. Israelis are certainly in no mood for a two-state solution, but they also understand that is still what the international community wants. They also, many Israelis understand that, the local domestic considerations of Blinken's word, no one believes there could be a two-state solution at any time soon anyway, even if there was the greatest will from Israel, the greatest will from the US, because the Palestinians simply have no will, even Mahmoud Abbas, let alone Hamas. So a lot of it is, there's an understanding, a lot of it is just verbiage. It's just, to state, to try and put a positive spin and say, for the Americans are trying to say that something good has to come out of it. And what we've learned from October 7th is without some peace process, this is what happens. Israelis have learned the absolute opposite, that October 7th taught, as I said, I'm not speaking for every Israeli, but a very large, I would say a very large majority, that October 7th taught them the opposite, that you can't trust them, that they do mean when they want to come and murder Israelis, and they do mean it when they want to destroy the state of Israel and cause as much bloodshed as possible. So Israelis are learning very, very different lessons from this than the international community and even our good friends in the US.
Yeah, speaking of the international community, so Eric, an anonymous attendee, asked, why is Israel going to appear at the ICJ, and why should they give the group any appearance of a normal objective organization? They have no chance of winning. What does it mean? And is it foolish?
Well, as I said, as opposed to the 2004 ruling, this one is far more consequential. One can imagine if Israel loses this and is ruled as a country that's engaged in genocide. I mean, that has major, major ramifications, even if not necessarily legal ones. It would be a disaster, and it would certainly cause all sorts of problems. So there's that level. And also the fact is Israel knows that it has a good case. So if it is given a fair hearing, it should, I'm not saying easily because there's nothing easy about this, but it should be able to bat away that accusation. So it wasn't an easy decision. There were certainly those who are against Israel appearing and Israel showing up to this one as opposed to the previous decision. But the decision it's by actually appearing and presenting its case, it's the least worst of the two options. I think that's probably how most people say it. Obviously, Israel would prefer that the charge never happened, if South Africa hadn't been manipulated into doing this, if this whole thing hadn't happened. But there is a feeling that Israel cannot just ignore this. It's not just another sort of case like in 2004.
Understood. Thank you. Reuven Hawk asked, yesterday the U.S. and British navies downed 18 drones, 2 cruise missiles, and an anti-ship missile fired by the Houthis targeting shipping in the Red Sea. Um, More. Do you think the U.S. and the coalition will do anything about these attacks?
Well, it is. I mean, the list that the questioner laid out is already something. They are doing it. They're still in defensive posture. The debate is whether they'll go to offensive posture. At the moment, it doesn't seem to be the case. They don't seem to want to get into some sort of fight with the Houthis, even the vessels that it did sink, the speedboats that tried to attack a ship, I think it was last week, they did so only after the Americans themselves were fired on. So they're very, very loath to get into an actual battle with the Houthis. At the moment, it's just shooting down anything that they launch against shipping fleets or towards Israel. I don't know if this is going to change. There doesn't seem to be a great appetite or interest to get into what would be a conflict with the Houthis, but it's certainly not off the table at this point.
Thank you. Judy Hirschon asks, could you comment on Strook and concerns regarding security and what she said had been allowed into Gaza, including motorcycle and boat parts?
Are you talking about Orit Strook, the minister?
Probably. I'm not familiar with this.
I'm also not familiar with the particular quote. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Thought I'd throw it out there. Lisa Bernard asks, is there any information on the drug Captagon, its suppliers, and the role it plays among Hamas combatants?
Sorry, so, about the drug?
Yes.
I didn't hear. About the drugs that the Hamas combatants were taking when they launched their attack on October 7th. I mean, there's not really much to be said about this. Apparently, they were drugged up when they did it. I mean, there's been this week the release of more. What are they called? The head cameras, the pro cams. What are they called? I can't remember what they're called. The GoPro. That's it. The GoPro cameras, as many of the Hamas terrorists came in. They had some of their forces with GoPro cameras, and Israel is still finding a lot of them in Gaza, or they found it during the early days in some of the areas which they attacked, and some of them were killed. And you can see that there's something. I mean, obviously, there's something not right with them because they're mass murderers and all the rest of it. But it's clear that they were on something, or at least some of them were. there's a big debate after watching these cameras, and it's clear that there were different levels, as there are in any military, between the much higher levels, which really were, behind the really professional planning of this attack, which really understood Israel's weaknesses and played on that, and then some of the lower down troops, the Nukhba, who just came into Israel and didn't really know what they were doing, just running around and looking for people, didn't understand why there weren't people here, and they didn't know where they were. So there really was quite a lot of difference. I don't know if they were all on drugs or part of them on drugs, but it's clear that some of them were on drugs, and that was purposely so, to try and, I guess, make them less feeling. I don't know, but that's what's been suggested by those who've looked into this.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That brings us to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week.
Thank you.
And for our viewers and listeners, please note there will be no webinar this Friday. And please be on the lookout for our weekly webinar offerings email coming out over the weekend. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.